Brian Walker is the leader of the Legalise Cannabis Party in Western Australia. He'll be their lead candidate in the upper house at the March state election. Really nice to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you've been sitting on the upper house crossbench for the past 4 years in a supermajority. Labor does not need your vote. Don't need the vote of the non-existent crossbenchers in the lower house either. How have you found that experience? Because just from an outsider, it's so incredibly rare for a party to have a supermajority like that. Have you been able to get much done?
Nothing. It's been an autocratic dictatorship, and I would say that very openly. I sat on the Committee for Legislation, which is designed to review the legislation coming to the House of Review just to see it's proper, fit and proper. And we have had in 4 years one single bill referred. One, only one. That's despicable, which means that the government thought that every single bill they put through was perfect. And we know that's not true. So what we have now is 4 years of faulty legislation now sitting on the statute book.
And that is, a long 4 years. We've seen some significant reform come in, one of which we'll get to a little later. Do you think, or are you hopeful that you might actually be able to get action on that? Because ultimately, I think you and I might agree that the most likely result is obviously another Labor government in March, not with necessarily an upper house majority, but still they would have all that power. Would they really want to do anything about legislation that they've just gone over the past 4 years with?
No, they'd like to keep it in the past, I think, and keep it unchanged. There's a number of examples I could give, but making a change now for them is actually just shooting themselves in the foot. They want to move ahead with further legislation that was going to advance their claim to be the party of the future. So they're going to carry on just putting further bills forward, and rightly so too.
Ultimately, as I said, right, there's only so much you could even possibly do in this situation. There's only so much a crossbencher from the Legalise Cannabis Party can do anyways, as what you have been for about a year now, one sole voice for that party in Parliament. On your key issue, legalising cannabis, not necessarily in terms of bills, but in terms of discussions, in terms of having the debate, has there been any progress regarding that?
I think, first of all, we've established that the vast majority of politicians of whichever flavour agree with what we're saying. Legalising cannabis is going to happen and it's necessary. The whole war on drugs is wrong, it's failed, it's costly in time, it's costly in lives, and so it should be repealed. That's a given. So we can go beyond that and look at, what's the actual intent? Why would I, a doctor, a professional, want to be legalising cannabis? Well, it's not just cannabis. It's where else has government lied to us? Where else have they said that this is the truth and it's not a truth and it's now in law? And I need to look after my patients. I'm a healer, I'm a medical practitioner. And so my focus on legislation is actually how can we serve the people better? And that's physical, mental, social, and financial wellness, as well as social justice. And in that, I have been able to put a voice out, a voice of common sense, a voice of professionality, and a voice of cooperation, which I've found resonance in the upper house, and I've found acceptance from all sides. And so I think, yes, I'm very happy with the 4 years that we've spent there, and I think the house has benefited from our presence.
So on that, if you've got most politicians who might be in favour of it, which naturally you think, oh, well, you just get it through then. And you do have, I don't have the exact polling necessarily in Western Australia, but there's certainly been polling in Australia over the years that has increased support for potential reform regarding legalised cannabis in various ways. And I hope there's some more polling on it because I'd love to see more polling. Why then has it just not been done? Do you really think the government is worried about it? Do they just not care? Is it again just part of the fact that they don't need to worry about you at the moment?
That's certainly true. It's not high on the list of things to be done yet. That will change, I'm sure, of course. The last polling I saw showed 79% of the population of Western Australia agreed that cannabis should be at least decriminalised, if not legalised. So why don't the politicians do it? Well, I think, first of all, they're as much a victim of propaganda as anyone else. And so the thought is, if we're perceived to be soft on drugs, then we'll lose votes. And that's really a big no-no for them as well. You can take it further and say, what about the whole policy on drugs? Now, I am, as a health practitioner, I've seen the way that drugs can ravage the population, in particular alcohol, and of course smoking, ravaging the health of our population. Should we continue to wage war against people's choices? And the answer is no. If we look at things differently, if we medicalize the illicit use of mind-altering substances and other agencies in our society, if we medicalize that, could we get better help organized? Could we reduce the incidence of, say, suicide? Because a lot of people take the illicit drugs are not taking it to become drug addicts, not at all. They're actually treating the symptoms of often mental health issues, or indeed the biggest problem I'm seeing is trauma, especially in childhood. There's such a lot of trauma that's unrecognized, undiagnosed, and people are not being discovered by the medical system, and therefore they're finding solutions using mind-altering substances, and that's the real problem we're facing. Let's fix that underlying problem first.
I'm really curious because goes without saying 99% of bills that you've been looking at have nothing to do with cannabis. And how are you going about, as a party that is, often described as single issue or single policy, how do you go about making those calls on whether or not to vote on legislation? Again, granted, the vote is largely meaningless given the Labor majority. But yeah, is it a party call? Are you making this, again, you've been the sole Legalise Cannabis MP for a while? Are you essentially making these calls as an independent? How are you basing those positions on something that isn't legalised cannabis?
Well, actually, most of the bills passing through do have, in some form or other, a relationship to cannabis. Now, it's either medicinal cannabis or it's industrial hemp, but we can find actually in almost every area of legislation a use for this. For example, energy. If we were to have the cannabis sativa, a plant used to produce hydrogen, and we could do that, that's an excellent use of a very healthy plant. We could even look at hemp as being useful at balancing a balance of trade, for example. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. And for example, $1.5 billion on pet bedding from hemp, or the ADF is using hemp and carbon fibers in a composite to form bullet and bomb-proof coverings for their motors. Could we send this into space? Yes, we could. What about things like innovative approaches to using, say, cannabinoids, which is essential for balancing our system? Should we add this to ice cream? Should we add this to beer or bread like we do with folic acid? Why not? These are issues that we could certainly be dealing with. But the question you asked was, how do we go about sorting this as a so-called single-issue party? And the first thing I would say is we're not a single-issue party, although the name does kind of make it difficult to say that. As a medical practitioner and a cannabis prescriber, I'm looking at physical, mental, social, and financial wellness, which is the World Health Organization definition of health, as well as social justice. And so our executive has given us permission to vote, a free conscience vote on everything coming by. The only stipulation is that when it comes to legalizing cannabis, we need to vote for that. That's the only one single point we have to agree on. Everything else, and you could even say, for example, if we had a member in the north of WA and another member in the south, I would expect them to vote differently on local issues because we represent the people, not the party.
Obviously, you did have a defection in this term, which accounts for 50% of your representation, which is never good for a minor party. And I think parties like yours often have to kind of build up credibility, partly because of the name, partly because people maybe are cautious when they're seeing, a party name like this. Same goes for other kind of, not a gimmick isn't the right word, but, Australian sex party and the like. How are you going to be building up credibility to say that, we are going, just like on what you've just discussed there, that we're able to vote on all these issues, we're able to do it independently. So yeah, how are you going to be able to make sure you keep that credibility up?
Well, I think my own personal persona in Parliament speaks for itself. You can look at my speeches or listen to them and hear what I've been saying, which crosses a wide area of legislation. This morning, for example, I was speaking with someone representing shooters in WA. Of course, the legislation, the firearms legislation, has passed recently, and that was actually a very improper use of legislation. A good idea, but the actual implementation was far from good. And so he was saying, well, listen, it's nice that you're supporting us, but cannabis, I can support it. No, I'm not certain. I'll have to make my decision later about that. Now, what he was saying is that the narrative around cannabis is this dangerous drug, and it's not. So I said, listen, do you know what? It's the same argument for the legislation of firearms. People here are led by the narrative, firearms are for criminals and you can kill people with them. And so it's the same process. The government controls a narrative suggesting if you have a gun, you're a bad person. And that's what they use to thrash this legislation through the upper house. And the people generally believe that guns are bad. And when you look at the actual figures of the damage caused by guns, it's actually very, very minimal. Road traffic accidents are far worse. Suicides using paracetamol, far worse. So we really ought to be aware of the government control of the narrative, governing people with fear, not with facts. And so cannabis is simply one part of that. And so I apply this legislation measure, if you like, everything I do. What are the facts? Where should we be? What's the government really saying? And what are they not telling us?
If you are re-elected in March, and let's say you get maybe one, two fellow legalized cannabis MPs up there with you, how are you going to be able to be more effective as an opposing voice to whoever is the government, probably Labor, than say, Liberals or the Nationals? I obviously appreciate they've got the weird opposition set up at the moment. But yeah, how are you going to make sure that, you are effective in opposing the government when I guess a lot of criticism at the Libs and Nats have been they can't do anything at the moment. They're ineffective. What are you going to be able to do?
Well, first of all, we've got to realise that the next parliament is going to be differently constituted. In the upper house, well, the lower house, I'm expecting a Labour Party victory, of course. I think there's going to be the red tide's going to come down a bit, but there's still going to be the majority. The upper house is a different story. The Labour Party will lose members, they will. The Liberal and National Alliance, that will probably increase a little bit. It's the crossbench where we can see a large increase. And the Labour Party internal polling suggests that we're going to be looking at 3 seats. I'm being more cautious and saying 2 seats. Now, in the upper house, where we have a larger crossbench and we can hold the government to account, we could actually be much more participatory in legislation. And we can get more bills referred onto the legislation committee. We can have more time to peruse the laws without being forced through with this guillotine that they've forced upon us, this change in standing orders. We can work, and this is the advantage that we have, as I have shown in the upper house. I can work with whoever is there, whether the government benches or the crossbench or the opposition. And I'm able to work as a sensible, educated health professional. I can work cooperatively with whatever is being put in front of me. And that, I think, stands us in good stead. Also, if you look at what the Legalise Cannabis Party has done, we've actually costed what we're expecting to see with legalizing of cannabis, which is $1.25 billion over the 4-year forward estimates. And from that, we're saying we could change these policies or make these changes to our society based on the available potential income that will be paid for, rather than saying, as the Greens often do, you do this and you find a way of paying for it. So we've actually got the fiscal sensibility. And we can also go further and say that we are a party of law and order. We like organized society. What we do not want is anything which allows people to live in an anarchy. And so the current laws that we have don't actually meet those needs. We're seeing a lot of violence in our society, and we would be suggesting a lot of legislation is leading us into being disoriented, disengaged, disenchanted. And we would like to see a change to that. And there we can speak with the government ministers and the government backbenchers and see what we can do to give sensible advice to support legalization or legislation, which would then support the people.
Just finally on the upper house reforms, we've discussed them before. It's a pretty low quota in comparison to some other states that use a statewide upper house, and I won't go full electoral nerd here, but I find that interesting. How are you feeling about the changes? Granted, your party has had not just in WA, mind you, in Victoria, where I'm somewhat of a benefit with potential group voting tickets and the way preferences were flowing there. How are you feeling now when you're not going to be relying on a guaranteed preference flow from one minor party to another, and you're also not going to be representing any specific local region?
Oh, that's a really broad question. Look, first of all, I would be saying this two-party preferred is actually false. We've been told that the two major parties are the ones you need to vote for. Anything else is a waste of a vote. Who says that? We need to listen to the views of the people. And if the two parties aren't representing the people, and I say they're probably not, then if you're just giving a vote to the ones you hate least, we're not doing yourself a proper service. Let's look at what people are actually saying, what the parties are actually putting forward as sensible options, and then choose that rather than just going what grandma did. Okay, so in the current, the new choice we're coming up just now, it's a quota for the upper house in Western Australia is 2.68%. Okay, that's quite a low quota, but it does set a bar above which, if there's a certain number of people would like to have this particular party, that will get accorded. And we can then find that the people's voice is better presented. And I really appreciate that, because if it's just either this or this, then we're not really getting the balance. We're not getting here the nuances of what the people actually want. And there's such a lot of need. And we're not a one size fits all. We're different people.
Be fun to watch. I'm sure we'll catch up again in the future. Brian Walker, Legalise Cannabis WA MP and that party's state leader. Thank you so much for your time and best of luck in March.
Thank you, Leo.